From Recorded Future News and PRX, this is Click Here. It's hard to even talk about the internet as if it's just one thing, because depending on when you first logged on, it can mean completely different things. For some, it's this.
The net began back in 1969. It was a tool of the Pentagon.
For others, it's...
You've got mail.
Or...
Pets.com, because pets can't drive.
And now, of course, there's AI.
I can speak in any language. Για παράδειγμα, αυτή τη στιγμή μιλάω στα ελληνικά.
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
And one of the people on the front lines of this, a kind of Forrest Gump of the internet, is a Canadian named Ron Deibert. Ron runs something called the Citizen Lab. And at its most basic level, it's a research center that investigates how governments, corporations, and bad actors use technology to do very grim things. Which is interesting because if you knew Ron as a kid, you wouldn't exactly think, future cybersecurity watchdog. Can you talk a little bit about growing up in Canada and your upbringing?
Sure. I don't get asked that question very often. I had an unlikely...
His dad was a mechanic. His mom was a housewife.
I grew up in a hardscrabble part of Vancouver. Most of the people that I hung out with, that I went to school with, ended up either in some kind of organized crime or in jail.
And as a kid, his idea of a good time was to break into churches and snack on the communion wafers. And school, that wasn't really a priority.
There wasn't a lot of higher education in my family. We had one book in the household that was a Bible that was never opened.
But they did have a television. Multiple TVs, in fact, and Ron watched everything. But the one thing he watched that had a profound effect on him was this incredibly American thing, the Watergate hearings.
Heading, what did the president know, and when did he know it?
Looking back on it, he said it was his first glimpse into a world of power and corruption and secrecy, something that would come to define his life's work. Because in a sense, Ron actually was built to fight against those things.
I witnessed bullying and intimidation firsthand growing up. I know what it's like. I don't like bullies. I especially don't like bullies getting away with things and hurting innocent people.
Eventually, Ron applied to university. He got in, one of the only kids in his class who did.
And I just was blown away reading philosophy, reading history, this whole world that was opened up to me.
This was the 1980s, and Ron got interested in political science, specifically Soviet politics. And in a way that feels like something right out of Forrest Gump, Ron found himself in East Berlin just as the wall came down. He returned to Canada ready to dive deep into Soviet studies, prepared to earn his doctorate. But fate, or rather a mentor, had other plans.
And he very sagely said, look, the Cold War's over. There are not going to be a lot of jobs for Sovietologists. So you need to come up with something else to specialize in. And he said, no one's looking at, the way he phrased it was the telecommunications revolution. And a light bulb just went off.
A spark of clarity, an epiphany. The kind of moment that changes your life. I'm Dina Temple-Reston, and this is Click Here, a podcast about all things cyber and intelligence. We tell true stories about the people making and breaking our digital world. And today, Ron Deibert and the birth of one of the most celebrated internet watchdog groups in the world. And we look back at the digital world we were promised and the one we actually got.
There have been great strides made in raising awareness about security risks and some amazing new tools to better communicate securely, like Signal. But against all of that, honestly, it's like we're living in a Philip K. Dick novel.
Stay with us. Click Here is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states. Support for Click Here comes from Curiosity Weekly, a podcast from Discovery. Each episode unpacks breaking science and tech news with experts who can make sense of it all. Recent episodes have covered what neuroscientists have learned from TikTok, how AI manages to read hieroglyphics, and whether today's robots can actually feel pain. All things I've wondered about. On Curiosity Weekly from Discovery, make sense of some of the biggest questions and ideas shaping our world. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts. From Recorded Future News, I'm Dina Temple-Rustin, and this is Click Here. While Ron was getting his PhD, he started studying satellite imagery. It was the final days of the Cold War, and the United Nations started building a high-tech global monitoring system to make sure that nations that said they had stopped testing nuclear weapons actually had stopped. Ron found himself with a sort of third-row seat to this technology. He was studying it for his program, but in a subtle guy in the back of the room, slightly out of focus in group pictures kind of way.
I didn't have any security clearance, but people kind of got used to having me being around. And I was privy to a lot of things I probably shouldn't have seen around the first.
It was eye-opening.
I got into this world, and it really opened my eyes to this concept of technology being used to verify whether governments are keeping to their commitments or doing something bad.
This was the early 90s. The internet was still, in the public imagination at least, this boundless utopian space.
The enthusiasm around the internet was very contagious, and I was caught up in it too. It was one story after another about all of these dramatic improvements in how we access information and communicate with each other, something that was oriented towards more freedom, more democracy, more individual empowerment.
The thinking then was governments couldn't possibly control something as expansive as the internet, which meant that sooner or later, the world would be awash in this free flow of information, this tidal wave of democratic ideas.
Serious people were talking about it in that way. It'll be impossible for authoritarian regimes to withstand this, tsunami of information.
But Ron, the kid who had grown up in East Vancouver, who had seen enough to make him skeptical of big promises, wasn't quite so sure. Yes, the internet could be a force for good, but he had already seen up close how else it might be used. If governments were using technology to map entire countries from space, to track weapons, to spy on adversaries, then why wouldn't they use it to monitor their own people?
I thought governments are already doing things in the subterranean realm of telecommunications. There's no way that this is not going to happen around the internet.
And that's when he started thinking, if governments were using technology to watch people, why couldn't people use that same technology to watch them right back?
This is a model that could be appropriated by citizens, by scientists, by even academics to watch what governments are doing and hold them accountable.
And just like that, the idea for the Citizen Lab was born.
Let's find out what's going on beneath the surface of the internet that citizens need to know about.
By then, Ron had his PhD, he was teaching at the University of Toronto, and as he went around campus, he started keeping an eye out for a place to set up his lab, somewhere where he could go unnoticed.
So I identified a building that was under construction, and I actually smuggled myself in while it was under construction and identified a small basement space, got the permission of
A basement. It was, in his words, their little hacker hothouse. And his first hire? A fellow East Vancouver native named Nart Villeneuve.
also a bit of a street kid himself, had no computer science training, was a self-taught hacker.
A guy who loved computers so much, he didn't even consider this a job.
I found out from our payroll office that many months had gone by and he had not submitted his timesheet to get paid. He told me he couldn't actually believe that someone was paying him to do the work that he was doing, which he would have gladly done for free.
Every day, Ron and Nart sat in that basement, blasting heavy metal, hunting for malware. And it turns out Nart had this special gift. All on his own, he'd figured out a way to connect to computers in China and browse the internet as if he were inside the country, without China knowing.
Something that we do now routinely in the Citizen Lab, but it was the first time I had seen this presented. And what he was doing there was trying to cross-check, what web content is being blocked by China.
And as they followed that digital trail, they suspected this was happening in other authoritarian regimes. So they started poking around in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran. Because at the time, the internet was, well, let's just say, far less secure than it is today.
People constructed things in such a way that if you knew where to look, you could find a lot.
And then in 2008, Ron got a call from a researcher.
A person named Greg Walton, and we had a few
who worked with activists and NGOs in Tibet. Greg explained that they'd been having these weird computer virus problems.
They were saying, we're being flooded with this stuff. Is this something we should be concerned about?
And Ron thought, well, yes. And then Greg mentioned something else.
Simultaneously, people in those communities were occasionally being arrested, and it seemed like authorities knew in advance things that they were planning and doing, suggesting that they were under surveillance.
This time, Ron's team got on a plane. They flew to India, to the home of the Tibetan government in exile, to look into this for themselves. And then, with the activists' consent,
we effectively wiretapped their machines.
And they took all the data back to their lab. And what they found is that the Dalai Lama's aides were right to be worried. His computer had been hacked. But what was even more surprising was that the hackers had made this huge mistake.
They had left a directory wide open, allowing us to see this very well-organized spreadsheet that they maintained online of all of the victims that they had compromised.
And when he says all the victims, he doesn't just mean the Dalai Lama's networks. The spreadsheet listed the IP addresses of some 1,300 computers in 103 different countries.
Ministries of Foreign Affairs, diplomatic missions, ASEAN, banks. We were looking over the shoulders of spies who were involved in a global cyber espionage campaign. And it was truly the first of its kind.
The breadth and scale of the hacking program was unprecedented.
We just looked at each other like, what the hell? What do we do with this? This is unbelievable.
So they did what researchers do. They named the hack, called it GhostNet, and wrote a report about it. And then they just went back to work. Or at least they tried to.
Well, when the day of that report came out, journalists flooded to the university. There were trucks parked outside of the building. I remember walking up to the lab that morning, and I'm thinking as I'm walking, geez, I wonder what's going on here today.
And it was you.
That was us. Yeah, we were the biggest story in the world that day.
Their little basement lab was on the front page of the New York Times.
A lot of smart people said, wow, I had no idea that this could happen, that my computer, which I see as a window to the world, could also, in the very next minute, be looking back at me.
For some, though, Citizen Lab was a little too effective. When we come back, it turns out that they weren't just making headlines. They were making enemies, too.
This is the same for any investigative journalist who antagonizes powerful people. There are going to be consequences. And maybe I didn't fully anticipate where that would come from.
Stay with us.
When was the last time you said, I never thought about it that way? The Current aims to give you that moment every single day. Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and our award-winning team brings you stories and conversations to expand your worldview. Sometimes they connect to the news of the day, sometimes to the issues of our time. And you'll hear all kinds of people on The Current, from best-selling authors to maybe your neighbor. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, now including YouTube. I'll talk to you soon.
From Recorded Future News, this is Click Here. I'm Dina Temple-Raston. In the back of his mind, Ron expected his work would make him enemies. These days, he can't step foot in China, and the Saudis and Jordanians and Mexicans aren't too happy with his team's research either. But he was surprised by the blowback a little closer to home.
But it also seemed to antagonize the Canadian government.
Why was that?
I can only speculate. And I've come to settle on what we were doing presented a risk not just to whoever it was that we were publishing about. It had to do with the whole realm of cyber espionage as a whole and espionage generally, which all governments do.
And governments, democratic or otherwise, would prefer that their, let's say, activities stay in the shadows. But what the Citizen Lab was doing was pulling back the curtain.
There's an immediate risk for the Canadian government. Oh, there's this small group in a basement in Toronto upsetting things by doing this, and this is going to cause us diplomatic blowback. I wasn't privy to that, but I'm sure they experienced it. In fact, I know the University of Toronto's president at the time told me he faced a lot of pushback from Chinese officials, which he resisted, to his credit. But I'm sure the Canadian government experienced that as well. I'm sure that went through their mind. If we are to believe what Deibert is saying, we might be next.
Because espionage, the kind the Citizen Lab was exposing, all governments do it. And over the next few years, Ron and his crew seemed to be finding a lot of it, making headlines around the world.
How truly free is the internet?
Computer researchers in Canada have created what some say is the most advanced tool yet in helping internet users.
It's called Siphon. It's a software program that's been created.
Basement Computer Lab at the University of Toronto.
The Citizen Lab would go on to expose hacking programs targeting dissidents, journalists, lawyers, teachers, governments, corporations, intelligence agencies. No one seemed to be off limits. The Citizen Lab had built a machine to watch governments and flag their abuse, and Ron seemed to find it nearly everywhere he looked. And over the years, the abuse he found got more insidious, more sophisticated. No more so than what he and his team uncovered in 2016. It started with a single suspicious text sent to an activist named Ahmed Mansour in the United Arab Emirates.
He received a text message on his iPhone that contained a link that, if he clicked on it, would have activated a zero-day exploit.
Zero-day exploit, a vulnerability not yet discovered by the people who made the software it takes advantage of. No patch yet, no defense, just an open door for hackers to slip into. Fortunately, Ahmed did what you're supposed to do when you get a fishy text or email. He called the Citizen Lab.
Instead of clicking on that, he shared it with Bill Marzak, the lead technical researcher in the Citizen Lab, who set up a system in the lab that allowed him to capture all of those ingredients, including Pegasus.
Pegasus, a piece of spyware we've talked about before, sold by an Israeli company called NSO Group. It wasn't just another piece of malware. This was something different. Eventually, it would be able to infect a phone without the user doing anything, and then actually take control of it.
It can turn on the microphone even when you're not using a phone call and just record what you're doing in the room. It can turn on your camera. It can record what's on your screen.
And all of this was legal. For years, Pegasus was marketed and sold to governments under the understanding that it would be deployed against criminals and terrorists. That was the pitch. But the reality was something else entirely.
And so that was August 2016. That was the first time we encountered it.
You went out with a report about NSO a short time later?
Yes, the $1 Million Dissident Report was the first ever report on Pegasus. And that, for us, that was as big, if not more, a deal than GhostNet.
People started bringing their phones to the Citizen Lab to get them checked for spyware. And in 2021, it even got the attention of the White House. Former President Joe Biden announced that he was putting NSO Group on a federal blacklist. He signed an executive order to restrict the use of commercial spyware by the U.S., and for Ron, this was the sort of thing that the Citizen Lab was supposed to help make happen.
All of those things that you hope would come out of your research were starting to happen. And I just couldn't believe that there were these outcomes. An executive order being put out there by President Biden on commercial spyware. Phenomenal. This is like the holy grail.
But Ron wasn't punching the air for long. Now he has to deal with the Trump administration.
You know, there have been great strides made in raising awareness about security risks and people, documenting internet censorship and surveillance and cyber espionage. But the very mission that we set up for ourselves to act as a counterintelligence for civil society, I think that mission is now at the greatest risk that it's ever been in the last 23 years that we've been around. Keep in mind that they're very explicit about going after academic centers like the Citizen Lab. I could very well foresee aggressive litigation efforts coming at us and other groups to try to shut us down.
But his concerns go beyond the Citizen Lab, beyond the United States. He's worried about the world.
All of the gains that we've made are almost certainly now at risk, but there'll be ripple consequences as well throughout the world because of his behavior. It's going to open up the opportunity for oligarchs and dictators around the world to model themselves on that behavior.
And the way Ron sees it, things are going to get worse before they get better.
We're in for a very dark period. So, our mission now, it takes on a new meaning in this current environment. We've got a lot of work to do.
Want to learn more about Ron Deibert and the Citizen Lab? Ron has written a new book called Chasing Shadows from Simon & Schuster. Author Margaret Atwood called it essential reading, and we agree. It tells not just Ron's story, but how the Citizen Lab became the world's foremost digital watchdog. We thank him for sharing it with us early, because we couldn't put it down. This is Click Here.
If you're looking for a daily guide to cybersecurity news and policy, sign up for the Cyber Daily from Recorded Future News. It serves up the day's most interesting and important cyber stories from our sister publication, The Record, and then aggregates all of the big cyber stories you might have missed from news outlets around the world. Just go to therecord.media and click on Cyber Daily to get all you need to know about the world of cybersecurity right in your inbox.
Today is Tuesday, February 25th, and here are some of the top cyber and intelligence stories of the past week.
Thailand is cracking down on cyber scam networks run from labor camps across its border with Myanmar.
As many as 1,000 Chinese nationals who were rescued from online scam centers in Myanmar last week are scheduled to return home following an international crackdown on these operations. All told, thousands of foreigners were freed last week from these scam centers, where workers are forced to run romance and investment scams for organized criminal rings. China and Thailand are now working together to try to bring an end to the practice. Myanmar officials say they will deport some 10,000 people linked to the online crimes. The Securities and Exchange Commission is scaling back on a special unit of more than 50 lawyers who have been focused on crypto enforcement actions. The move is part of a broader campaign by the Trump administration to give cryptocurrency and other digital assets a bit of a boost. One of President Trump's first executive orders was aimed at, in his words, eliminating regulatory overreach on digital assets. Some of the SEC lawyers in the crypto unit are being assigned to other departments. A spokesperson for the SEC declined to comment. And finally, a little more of Elon Musk's space junk plummeted to Earth last week.
In a surprising turn of events, rocket debris from a SpaceX rocket has fallen on Polish soil.
A 3.5-foot piece of a fuel tank fell near a warehouse in Poland. And while no one was hurt, it was an unusually large piece of debris, because most space junk burns up on re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Experts say the sheer number of launches these days is making heavy things falling from space a real concern. Today's episode was produced by Zach Hirsch, Sean Powers, Megan Dietrich, Erica Gaida, and me, Dina Temple-Rustin. It was edited by Karen Duffin, fact-checked by Darren Ankrum, and contains original music by Ben Livingston, with some other music from Blue Dot Sessions. Our staff writer is Lucas Riley, and our illustrator is Megan Goff. Martin Peralta is our sound designer and engineer, and Click Here is a production of Recorded Future News and PRX. Tune in on Friday for Mic Drop, which features our favorite interview of the week. We'll see you then.
If you're looking for a daily guide to cybersecurity news and policy, sign up for the Cyber Daily from Recorded Future News. It serves up the day's most interesting and important cyber stories from our sister publication, The Record, and then aggregates all of the big cyber stories you might have missed from news outlets around the world. Just go to therecord.media and click on Cyber Daily to get all you need to know about the world of cybersecurity right in your inbox.